Good evening. I'm here today to talk to you all about Dagon or Dagon. I found a mysterious or esoteric revelation that came to me connecting assyriology, ethiopic or Ethiopian studies, and americana studies, or the study of American literature and history. I'm also someone who grew up as a fanatic of science fiction and fantasy, and especially the liminal space where they meet in horror and the like. So I want to talk a little bit. I'm no assyriologist. Maybe one day I will be, but a little bit about that via Encyclopedia Britannica, which I think is the smart man's Wikipedia, and then or the man of letters Wikipedia, and then a little bit about the Ethiopian church. And then I want to read for you H.P. Lovecraft's story of Dagon, which is one of his earliest stories, which was written in 1917. I probably won't finish it. Maybe I will. We'll see how I go. And once I've completed that, I don't know, 5-10 minutes, if there are any questions, comments, or concerns from the subscriber audience, which is the only audience I allow to comment, it's a closed circle. I will address those to the best of my ability. And of course, I will address you with extra grace if you are one of the people that uses super stickers or super chats. Shout out to all of those who've done so in the past and are helping slowly but surely to grow this channel to one day be self sustaining and thus more and more and more, spelled MOAR, production for your consumption. So, again, there's a connection between Assyriology, Ethiopian studies, and American or Americana studies. So let's go to the Encyclopedia Britannica and you look up Dagon or Dagon, as we say in Ge'ez. And here is what it says. It says he's a West Semitic deity or god of crop fertility, and he was worshipped extensively throughout the ancient Middle East or Near East. He was the Hebrew and the Ugaritic common noun for grain. A lot of times you see that there's functionality to the demons like Mammon, the spirit of money. This is not in the text there. This is me commenting. But like Mammon, the spirit of money, sometimes it's just money by itself, but then there's a demonification or a personification of money known as Mammon. So we have grain, and then you have a grain deity or a crop fertility, agrarian agriculture deity named Dagon. Go back to Britannica. And the god, Dagon, was the legendary inventor of the plow. His cult is attested as early as about 2500 BC. And according to texts found at Ras Shamra, which is ancient Ugarit in the West Semitic side, he was the father of the god Baal. Baal, another demon, this is my commentary, from the scroll or the book of the 12, better the scroll of the 12 minor prophets at the end of the Hebrew Bible. Within that scroll, you find Hosea. In Hosea, you see the disloyalty or the lack of faithfulness of the people of God. And particularly when they have food insecurity, they're always lusting after Baal, Baal. I actually first came across the name Baal playing Diablo 2 as a kid growing up, and obviously knew he was up to no good. He had nefarious purposes, so had no interest in besieging him for crops, but we all have our own idols. Going back to Britannica, Dagon had an important temple at Ras Shamra and in Palestine, where he was particularly known as the god of the Philistines. He had several sanctuaries or holy places, including those at Beit Dagon, or the house of Dagon, in Asher, sends you to Joshua 19:27, In Gaza, sends you to Judges 16:23, and Ashdod sends you to 1 Samuel 5:2-7. At Rashamra, Dagon was apparently second in importance only to El, the supreme god. So this is good for the overall context of Near Eastern or Canaanite religions, which had very similar pantheons, something I learned a few years ago from Dr. Michael Heiser, uh, important Hebrew Bible scholar to read. So, finishing what Britannica has to say, although his functions as a god of vegetation seem to have been transferred to Baal about 1500 BC, I guess a little father to son transfer of power there going on. So, thousands of years of a cult or a worship around him makes it quite interesting. Why did I start thinking of this? What was the spark for this? The Ethiopian church has a high holiday called Hadar Tzion. Hadar is the month, roughly November. Tzion is Zion. Be careful about saying Zion in Hebrew. I won't tell you what it means, but it's phallic. So anyway, Tzion is first that mountain on the hill in the wilderness where David, the shepherd who became king, worshipped God. It's important to remember that he's a shepherd because you see with Baal and Dagon as the deities of agriculture, of agrarian society, the Hebrew Bible is within this context set as obviously a product of civilization and thus of agrarian culture, but using the most self-emulating, the most self-deprecating literature ever written. You could say the most anti-Semitic text ever is the Hebrew Bible, but not for the sake of some other human tribe, but for the sake of the glory of their deity, Yahweh, Adonai, the Lord. And he is pitted as a shepherd deity against the farming or agriculture deities of Baal and Dagon. So it goes from the mountain to the New Testament understanding in the historic apostolic churches that Mary is like that mountain as well, because through her we gain Jesus. And so she is this amba matagya, this hill that draws us nearer to the Lord. And then the ultimate meaning is in Qadasi Mariam, or the anaphora of Our Lady, the Holy Virgin Mary, attributed to Abba Hiriakos in our tradition, in the Ge'ez Rite. And within the liturgy, at the end, the final prayer of the priest says, O antemu hizbe Christian, O you Christian people who are gathered here today, as you are gathered here today, may he gather us in Mount Zion and in the Jerusalem above. As you are gathered here today, may he gather us in Mount Zion and in the Jerusalem above. Badabra Zion, Jerusalem Samayawit. Very beautiful. So it goes from the hill in the wilderness of David, a shepherd, not a farmer, to Our Lady, the Holy Virgin Mary, to the place where even she goes. And all of us, upon confidence in the Lord, are going, if the Lord wills, on Judgment Day, to not the civilization built with the hands of humankind, but to that perfect city of peace and righteousness, of sidq and of salam or shalom, which was not tainted by any human hands, any human constructions, which you can find even in the creation of Eve, the role of the building blocks of the ribs of Adam. From the very beginning, you see humanity always glorifying the works of their hands rather than the works of God. To this day, I mean, we have people who appreciate nature, but oftentimes we appreciate our role in nature rather than just the nature that the Lord Himself directly applied. So, anyway, we were at the Mount Zion High Holiday, Hidar Zion, and we are hearing Kine, which I shared on my channel. You could go to the Zikr Dusan page and see I shared on their Instagram. It's about a 16-minute video. I think it's about a 10 or 11-minute video on their YouTube. So find their Instagram, Zikr Dusan, if you want the 16 minutes. And I think the 10 or 11 minutes is on their YouTube. You could hear Abba Abraham singing the poetry that was written but not presented in written form, presented in spoken form by Qais Dassaling or Malaka Salam Dassaling. And they are going back and forth. Malaka Salam is reading or reciting the poetry from heart, and Abba Abraham, hearing it for the first time, is singing the melodies. And in this poetry that they are collaborating on and co-authoring, as is our right tradition, it begins by saying Dagon zoda arwe le'mahayela bet'ibitu laila faturan abau. So Dagon, the subject of today, is the crown of beasts, the mother of the fawn, with his insolence or his haughtiness upon the creatures who were fathers. And it ends by saying, "Bat'ibitu ladagon qatalo." Qatalo. So I can't translate the entire Giz poetry. I'm far, 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 far too uneducated in the art and science of Qane or Giz poetry to translate it all. But from what little I understand, tying it together with the Hebrew Bible and Ethiopia's unique position, which I spoke about with Jonathan Pajot on his channel, and he's made multiple videos on the subject as well. You see the moving of the Ark of the Covenant from Israel to Ethiopia, and you see in the extra biblical stories, especially, but within the biblical story as well, combat between the Ark of the Covenant and the other relics of other deities, which is to say, the relics of demons. And no matter how arrogant, how haughty, how self exalting and self aggrandizing these other deities are, ultimately they are killed by the power of God. So, this fish or agrarian deity known as Dagon exists in Assyriology, it exists in the Hebrew Bible, it exists in the Ethiopian church, and so is a topic to be studied, was written about just a couple weeks ago and posted now on YouTube in original Ge'ez poetry, which means that Ge'ez is not a dead language, but a living tongue. I'll say it again, and it bears repeating because in Semitic languages or in Semitic tongues, we repeat ourselves for the sake of emphasis. Ge'ez is not a dead language, but it is a living tongue. Hiyao lisan w'etu. That just said the same thing in Ge'ez. So in his arrogance, in his haughtiness, in his insolence, in his self aggrandizement, Dagon is killed. So, anyway, that's the Assyriology, the Hebrew Bible, and the Ethiopian studies. Took about 14 minutes. I see people commenting. I'm not going to get to it. Now I'm going to read H.P. Lovecraft. So, imagine this is poetry written in 2021 Western calendar, along with a deity who has been worshipped since 2500 BC and whose son was also worshipped after that. And then in the early 20th century, which is to say the early 1900s, 1917, you get H.P. Lovecraft, the founder of American horror, uh, and no doubt a literary great that has been studied a lot and that still needs to be studied. and I have a big old fat book that I'll flex on you on and probably never read. But I have read this story before of Dagon. And so it stuck out to me that there's this connection with America because I'm a man of all of these liminal spaces, particularly a man of letters and hopefully of numbers of all of these spaces. So, how can I position this book so that you hear me best? I think this nice sideways angle. So, I'll try to read. If my voice gets too dry, I'll stop reading. But if I could read the whole story, it's a very short story. I will. If I get tired, I'll stop and I'll address the comments at the end. This is Dagon by H.P. Lovecraft. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more, penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable. I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhere south of the equator. Of the longitude, I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished, for there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight, save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me. But I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. All at once, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, Yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water, on account of their enormous size, were an array of bas reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Dore. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint, grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms. The while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. But soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever as I lay sun stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man of war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likeness on a submarine obelisks of water soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war exhausted mankind, of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand, the window, the window. So that's the end of the Lovecraft short story. As a reminder, for those of you who may have joined late, there is a connection between H.P. Lovecraft and American literature. Ethiopic or Ge'ez poetry created in 2021 AD, as well as the Hebrew Bible and assyriology or the Akkadian Empire, whose general purview is the context and setting in which the Hebrew Bible arises. And so all of these things are connected. Mankir Yamana had a message, but he retracted it. I really wish I knew what that message was. He's a great student of Goethe's poetry. Skelly Priest, hey brother, love your stuff. Thank you. Just stop again. God be praised. Amen. Ivan, I know that fish god only from the Lovecraft novel. Yeah, well, he shows up in, of course, he comes from ancient Assyria or the Akkadian Empire. Then you see him in the Hebrew Bible from all the references from Britannica that I listed and the general kind of background. And then that's picked up into Ethiopian Christianity, which is still in this day and age, creating live poetry. I don't see any questions. I'll give you about 30 seconds to a minute to give me any questions, comments, or concerns, points of emphasis or de emphasis. If you don't have that, then I'll close out for the day. This video has been long enough. All right. Doesn't look like there are any more questions. Thank you all. Have a blessed Sabbath. Shabbat Shalom.